Headlines flash a stunning warning across global markets. A seismic shock hits the heart of America's energy ambitions. China, the world's largest and most voracious oil market, has just slammed the door shut, cutting off U.S. crude to a trickle. President Trump's signature policy of energy dominance is now facing a strategic nightmare as Beijing turns to Russia and Saudi Arabia for its long-term needs. The American shale revolution is facing a crisis of its own making. How did America's dream of dominating the world through energy turn into a strategic disaster? For a decade, the American shale revolution was more than an energy story. It was a geopolitical earthquake. A torrent of oil, unleashed by new technology, transformed the United States from the world's biggest energy consumer into a dominant global supplier. This newfound power was the bedrock of President Donald Trump's energy dominance agenda. American oil became a powerful tool of foreign policy, a way to reward allies and punish adversaries. The U.S. was the new swing producer, capable of reshaping global markets at will with a seemingly endless sea of shale oil. But this golden age of American energy power was built on a fragile foundation of global trade, a foundation that Trump himself was actively trying to shatter. As he championed the shale boom with one hand, he waged a chaotic, multi-front trade war with the other. The primary target was China, the fastest growing and largest oil market in the world. The constant threat of tariffs, sanctions, and political instability created a toxic atmosphere of unpredictability. For a country like China, which must secure its energy supply decades in advance, the United States was beginning to look less like a reliable partner and more like a volatile threat. The very policies designed to make America strong were eroding the trust needed to sell its most valuable commodity, giving rivals like Russia and Saudi Arabia the opening they had been waiting for. President Donald Trump's vision for America was clear, simple, and powerful. Transform the nation into an energy superpower that could not be challenged. His energy dominance agenda was a cornerstone of his presidency. He dismantled environmental regulations, opened up federal lands for drilling, and championed the shale industry as the engine of a new American century. In his view, oil wasn't just a commodity, it was a weapon. By exporting massive quantities of crude and natural gas, the U.S. could reduce the influence of OPEC, counter Russian aggression in Europe, and dictate terms on the world stage. For a time, the strategy appeared to be working. American oil flowed to every corner of the globe, and the U.S. became a net energy exporter for the first time in generations. But this entire strategy was predicated on a fatal contradiction. To dominate the world through energy, you need access to the world's markets, and the biggest, most important market of all was China. Even as he tried to sell more oil, Trump was simultaneously waging an increasingly hostile trade war that created deep instability. More critically, his own protectionist policies were actively harming the very industry he claimed to support. The tariffs he placed on imported steel made the pipelines needed to transport oil from the Permian Basin more expensive. Duties on specialized equipment slowed down operations and increased costs for drillers. This created a squeeze. While the White House was talking about dominance, its own policies were putting a strain on the financial flows of the shale patch. The final blow was a collapse in the global oil price, which fell by 16% as OPEC Plus began to increase its own production, flooding the market with cheaper crude. Suddenly, American oil was more expensive to produce and facing a global glut. The dream of energy dominance was colliding with the harsh reality of Trump's own chaotic economic policies. Faced with an increasingly unreliable and hostile United States, China made a strategic decision that would shake the foundations of the global energy market. It didn't just reduce its purchases of American oil, it slammed the door shut completely. Data from mid-2025 showed that for 5 consecutive months, China, the world's largest oil importer, had bought 0 barrels of U.S. crude. Its imports had plummeted from a peak of around 160,000 barrels per day to nothing. This wasn't a market fluctuation, it was a geopolitical realignment. Instead of relying on the volatile American market, China turned to America's biggest rivals. It began signing new, long-term, multi-billion-dollar supply contracts with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. These weren't spot purchases. They were deep, structural commitments designed to secure China's energy future for decades to come, effectively locking the United States out. But the most revolutionary part of China's strategy was not just who it was buying from, but how it was paying. Beijing began to aggressively push for these new, massive oil contracts to be settled not in US dollars, but in its own currency, the Chinese yuan. This was a direct assault on the petrodollar system, the bedrock of American financial power for the last half-century. For 50 years, the global oil trade has been conducted almost exclusively in dollars, creating a constant global demand for American currency and giving Washington immense geopolitical leverage. By creating a new yuan-based energy trading system with Russia and the Gulf states, China was building a parallel financial universe, one where the United States no longer made the rules. It was a quiet revolution, a strategic masterstroke that threatened to reroute not just the flow of oil, but the flow of global power itself. This left President Trump in a strategic nightmare, a situation described in viral videos and market analysis as a freak out. His entire vision of energy dominance was crumbling. The world's largest market had not only vanished, but it had actively allied with his rivals to create a new America-free energy architecture. With a global supply glut pushing prices down and his own tariffs driving costs up, US oil producers were now sitting on a product that was becoming increasingly difficult to sell. The weapon of energy had been turned against him. He was trapped. To continue the trade war was to guarantee America remained locked out of the world's most important market. But to back down would be a humiliating political defeat. The dream was dead, and the United States was now facing a crisis of its own making. Nowhere was the dream of American energy dominance more real than in the Permian Basin. This sprawling ocean of oil was the engine of the shale revolution, a place where wildcatters became millionaires and small towns boomed into bustling cities. The promise of ever-growing global demand, particularly from China, fueled a frenzy of investment. Billions of dollars poured in to fund new drilling, new pipelines, and new technologies. The livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of American workers, from engineers in Houston to truck drivers in West Texas, were staked on this dream. They were told that the world was desperate for their product and that the boom would last for a generation. When China slammed the door shut, the dream died with brutal speed. The loss of the world's biggest buyer, combined with a global price slump, sent a shockwave through the Permian. For the small and mid-sized independent producers who are the lifeblood of the shale patch, it was a catastrophe. Their financial models were based on a certain price and a certain level of demand. When both collapsed, their revenue streams dried up, rigs were shut down, drilling projects were canceled, and a wave of bankruptcies began to sweep through the industry. For the workers, the cost was immediate and personal. The high-paying jobs that had drawn them to the desert began to disappear, leaving families facing an uncertain future. The very policy that was supposed to make America great was now hollowing out its most dynamic industrial region. But the cost of this failed strategy was far greater than just lost jobs and bankrupt oil companies. It represented a fundamental blow to America's power and credibility on the world stage. For decades, the United States was seen as the indispensable player in global energy markets. Now, China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia had just proven that they could build a new system without it. The United States had been relegated from the center of the game to the sidelines. This sent a powerful message to allies and rivals around the world. America's word is no longer reliable, and its role as a stable supplier can no longer be trusted. Countries in Europe and Asia that were considering switching from Russian or Middle Eastern oil to American crude were now forced to reconsider, fearing they too could be caught in the crossfire of a future trade dispute. Even more damaging was the emerging threat to the petrodollar. The US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is the ultimate source of American economic power. It allows the country to borrow cheaply and to exert enormous influence through financial sanctions. The creation of a yuan-based oil market is the first serious challenge to that dominance in 50 years. While it may not replace the dollar overnight, it creates a viable alternative and accelerates a global trend of de-dollarization. The long-term consequences are staggering. It was a strategic own goal of historic proportions, a crisis born not from the strength of America's rivals, but from the recklessness of its own policies. A president's grand vision of energy dominance has crashed into the hard reality of his own trade policies, triggering a strategic crisis for the United States. The slamming door of the world's largest oil market has not only crippled America's shale industry, but has also accelerated a dangerous shift in the global balance of power. The US now finds itself on the outside looking in, its credibility as a reliable partner shattered. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both nations lose by trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.